Hello and welcome to another edition of Pioneer Valley Life. I'm James Sullivan and we're here in the studios of Easthampton's eMedia. Our producer is Jackson Foote, as usual. He always does a great job. And today we're going to do something just a little different. As you can see, I'm now sitting in the guest chair. So today's guest on my show is me. And today's interviewer is a former guest on my show, Thomas Draudt, who's going to talk to me.
Thank you, James.
Yeah, welcome.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Thomas Draudt, and I was a guest here on Pioneer Valley Life, show 17, just a little while back. And after I did the interview with James, I thought to myself, well, I'll bet you James has a pretty interesting story. So I offered to ask him if he wanted to be interviewed for his show and switch chairs, and he said yes. And here we are. Welcome to your show, James.
That seems somewhat familiar.
Yeah. You know, we have a lot to cover.
Yeah.
But I thought we'd start now in the present tense.
Okay.
And let's talk about this series.
Yeah.
Pioneer Valley Life.
Right.
Tell me about why you decided to do this.
Well, I first decided to try and do a show here on eMedia. I didn't know exactly what kind of show I would do. I think some of the first thoughts that I had were because of me becoming older and the aging process. I thought I might do a show about aging and have different guests talk about aging. And as I went through it and talked to Jeff and Jackson here and trying to get an idea for a show, somehow it came into my head that I should do a show about the whole Pioneer Valley and things that happen for life in the Pioneer Valley, because a lot of my life has taken place here in the Pioneer Valley. I first came to Amherst in 1963 as a freshman at UMass. And so, here I am now, almost 79 years old, and we're in, what year are we in? 2025. And so I've been doing this show for about a year and a half or so, and I'm quite happy with this show. I've had some great guests, including yourself. There have been, lots of people who have been, kind enough to come on my show and talk to me and let me lead them through their story. So here I am trying to deal with my own story.
All right. Well, great. I think it's. I've said this during our interview, but I think it's a great thing that you're doing here.
Yeah.
I want to thank you again. I think using the community access television for something like this is a great service to the community. So thank you for doing the show.
Yeah.
And but let's go back to 1963, when you arrived at UMass.
Right.
You kind of lived the hippie lifestyle for the first 10 years in the Valley.
Yeah, it took a while to get into that. 63 was a little bit pre-hippie. It was post-beatnik.
Okay. Okay.
And but the reason I came to UMass is because until I was 13, I lived in rural New York State. But then, unfortunately, my parents separated. My mother was originally from Worcester. She wanted to move back to Worcester, and so I had to go to Worcester. And so I went to high school in Worcester. Didn't like it. And I remember coming up for in my junior year in high school for a visit to UMass, and I said, oh, this is where I want to go to school. This is back in the country. In 1963, UMass had maybe 8,000 students tops. It was still had a real rural feel to it. You could drive through the middle of campus. There were no big, ugly buildings. As a matter of fact, the football field was right in the middle of campus, right where the administration building is now.
Okay.
And, you could walk to the student union. As freshmen, we had to wear beanies. Everybody, the women had curfews. So it was a lot different.
Okay.
It was a real shock to me, though, to be in college. I didn't adjust to it real well, and technically I almost flunked out. But luckily, I didn't. And so for the first couple of years was just still an adjustment. And then all of a sudden, something struck me that, the people that I found more interesting on campus were the people who were starting to grow beards and let their hair grow longer. And I went, well, who are they? And so through the latter part of my college years, and then, that's when I became more of, a hippie, hanging out in the back of the hatch, where you knew who you were with. And, it was an interesting time to be around, because there was a lot of social change going on as well,
Yep.
in the entire world, in terms of things that were going on, in terms of the war, the racism, all of that. So it was an interesting time to be there, even musically, with people like Bob Dylan coming to sing at UMass, and Donovan, and some of the earlier shows. And one of the very first shows I saw at UMass, actually when I was a freshman, was a group called Taj and the Electras. And that was Taj Mahal singing, real, kind of soul, rock and roll. They were all wearing gray sharkskin suits. And, he played harmonica. He was great. And 2 years later, he's hanging out in the music room, wearing a suede jacket with an acoustic guitar. He totally reinvented himself and went on to be who he is today.
Wow.
And so it was an interesting time to be around there. But, when I graduated, I wasn't in any mood to be a college graduate. I said, what is this? How did that happen? I want to stick around here.
Now, what were you studying?
Well, I started out in engineering and quickly found out that was not for me because I flunked calculus. And so that was an impediment to going further in the engineering field. So I switched over to business because I didn't really have a facility for learning languages. And so I went into the business field, majored in marketing with an interest in advertising. But at that time, the jobs were on, Madison Ave in New York City. Mm-hmm. And I'm a guy up in Amherst, Massachusetts going, New York City? Why do I want to go there? Mm. Well, that's where the jobs are. You're supposed to get a job now. Right. Oh, I don't think I'm ready. And so, the hippie lifestyle was very appealing. Some of it was, especially during college, because there were less, pressures because you were in college, the environment was supporting you. But having graduated, I had to think for myself. What am I going to do? And I said, I don't know. I have no idea. And so I'll admit to some, drug and alcohol abuse that happened, but I dealt with it over time, and eventually, about 8 years after my first degree, I decided to go back to school, got a degree in turf grass management. So
you went from smoking grass to taking care of grass.
Taking care of grass. That's right, right. I don't know if the two are connected, in terms of the principles. Well, they are, yeah. You're growing something, a substance.
You wanted to be around grass.
Right.
But
some of it you could smoke, some of it you couldn't.
But you also had a background in golf. You
Yes.
were always a golfer.
Yes.
And so the turf management thing was kind of combining a few other things that you kind of had in your system.
Correct, yeah. Because my summer job during high school was as a caddy at one of the country clubs in Worcester. Mm-hmm. So that even added to my experience with golf. And so, going in and talking to the head of the program at Stockbridge School of Agriculture, which was part of UMass, still is, I got there and I went in July and I had the idea to do this. And I said, well, is there any possibility? He said, sure. Come on, you can come in right now. You can start with the September class. Oh, great. There was no delay or anything. They accepted a bunch of my credits from my first degree. So the transition into that program was really pretty easy. And he actually said, he said having an older student as part of the class would be important to him. So, okay. And that's what I was. I was an older student. And, but I really liked that. And it was a 2-year program. So you get out, they prepare you to get a job after 2 years, which was pretty good. Yeah. Yeah. And so I started off in the field of turf grass management, working as an assistant superintendent. I started out actually in California and worked out there for a couple of years, came back to Massachusetts, worked at a golf course in Winchendon, Mass, in Newton, Mass, and slowly things were changing in my life. I had taken a winter trip as a paid vacation to Europe and ended up meeting a woman who became my wife. And so that became part of my life, like in the early 80s, 79 into the early 80s.
Okay. And you also, I mean, you had traveled, you had been out to California in the
Yeah.
first 10 years of your UMass
Oh, yeah,
time.
definitely. Well,
and you've traveled to Europe a couple of times. So
Right.
you were here, but you kind of kept on coming back to the
Correct.
Pioneer Valley.
Correct.
And then once you got the turf management degree and started working on golf courses, that got you back on the golf course.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah,
And how was that experience for you? Had you sort of, was it a really good feeling to sort of be back in a place that you knew?
Yeah. It was, the job is outside, you're outdoors.
Yeah.
You're in nature.
Yep.
And that was very appealing.
So you knew that you were in a desk job kind of guy at that point.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
exactly.
what are you, like 29 years old, 20, 30, something
roughly,
like that?
I guess something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And but things started changing as well. I still had a fascination with Europe. In '84, I took a trip to Scotland as a golf vacation, and I said, "Oh boy, I love Scotland. Boy, it was tremendous." And came back and was once again at an impasse. And a friend of mine who I had worked in the golf course business with said it's not associated with the PGA Tour as it is now. And he said, he's looking for a caddy. And I said, would you be interested? I said. And at the time I was smart enough to say yes. And, not knowing, really, but I ended up taking a train from Springfield to Kissimmee, Florida, going to Melbourne and meeting a guy named Bruce Crampton, who was a well-known golfer from Australia, very much of a contemporary of Arnold Palmer, Jack Nicklaus, all of those guys. People I grew up watching, as an avid golfer myself. And so that turned out to be a really interesting experience. I really loved caddying. And once again, you were out on a golf course, but there was a lot of work to it. There's a lot of work to maintaining a golf course and knowing, when to mow, when to treat, when to do this, when to do that. You have to really keep on top of it, because your membership and the players really demand excellent conditions for what they pay for a greens fee or a membership in a country club.
Right. Did your turf management sort of experience help with caddying at all?
A little bit. It furthered my knowledge of just being out on a golf course.
Yeah.
And being familiar with the setting, so that greens and tees and fairways and all of that is not foreign to me, and just, you don't want to hit it in the trap and you don't want to hit it in the water, so that's pretty common.
Yeah.
And, so.
And as a golfer, were you learning from the, are you're like picking up tips from the golfers, from the golf side of it too?
Maybe, but your schedule is so busy, you really get very little time to play for yourself.
Okay.
Because say a tournament ends on a Sunday, it'll be a 3-day, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, when the seniors first started. The traditional PGA tournament these days is 4 rounds, but this was 3 rounds because they were all older, 50 years old. Mm-hmm. And, if the tournament ended on a Sunday, you really had to be at the next place on the schedule on Monday.
Oh,
because,
wow.
So.
And how are you getting around?
By car.
Around the country?
Yes. Yeah.
So you're driving like from Colorado to Delaware?
Could be, yeah. It just depended on the schedule.
Oh, man.
And so that...
that sounds kind of fun, though.
It was. Oh, yeah. I'm a big fan of scenery.
Yeah.
But some of it goes by at 60 miles an hour. It's not the same.
Yeah, no. Right.
Yeah, but, that's, what you see.
So,
but I enjoyed that part of it as well.
So do you have a favorite golf movie?
Well, there's Caddyshack, of course, but then there's also the famous one there with Kevin Costner, where he's just so stubborn that he won't hit the shot that he's supposed to hit.
Right.
I don't know I forget the titles.
I can't remember that one either.
But that's where Cheech Marin plays his caddy.
Right.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So when you watch those movies as a caddy,
yeah,
and there's Caddyshack, there's the one that Happy Gilmore,
right,
and then there's one called Loopers. Have you ever seen Loopers?
Yes, I have, just recently. Yeah.
And that was specifically about caddies.
Correct. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're paying some respect to them, I guess. Right. More so
because
mostly
over
they're
time,
kind of made fun of.
Right. When I started caddying, there was a real change in the caddy ranks. I myself, being white, college educated, was one of the first ones to come in to a environment that had almost been exclusively black, poor Southern caddies who grew up that way.
Yep.
But had new caddying at the club level, and happened to hook up with a pro and whatever, and when they were all, when the players were playing on the regular tour, they had these caddies, and like I say, most of them were black, and so it was a bit different, and same way, other people that were caddying were, there were some differences class-wise, shall we say?
Yeah, right.
And not too many caddies have grown up in private country clubs in those days.
Okay.
It might not be the case these days. These days, caddies make an unbelievable amount of money. So do the players. The players make an obscene amount of money in my mind.
Yeah.
And the caddies make a lot of money as well, because the standard is you get 10% if your player wins, 7 if it's a top 10, 5 if they make the cut, plus a weekly salary.
Yeah. Okay.
So, for instance, last week at the Players' Championship down in Florida, the winning player made $4 million as a prize.
Jeez.
So think what the caddy made.
Yeah. No, I can't even think.
$400,000.
Oh man.
When I was caddying, I'd be lucky if I made $1,000 or $2,000.
And that's like a week's worth of work, basically.
Yeah. Okay. But I mean, they say, well, they're out there year round. There's all this,
Right.
But a lot of them get their travel paid for, hotels.
But when you were doing it,
all my expenses were on mine.
Okay, so you got paid a wage, but you had to pay for getting there and
Correct.
everything. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, but at the time, you were happy with it.
I loved it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I went back to it several times, in the same way that I've come back to the Pioneer Valley at impasses in my life, or forks in the road, whatever you might want to say.
Yep.
Caddying, afforded me the same thing. Whereas I would say, what am I going to do now? Well, I guess I'll caddy. And I was lucky to be able to go back and make connections to get another job and just caddy and
You must have really stood out on the golf course.
Yeah.
What are you, 6'7"?
No, 6'5".
6'5"?
Yeah. Or at least I used to be. I don't know what I am now.
So you were called Slim, right?
Slim. Yeah, that was
that
every caddy had a nickname. And my roommate was from Texas, so of course he was Cowboy. That was his nickname. And there were lots of others that were really interesting. One as simple as they called them Golf Ball. And
Okay. Yeah.
Another one was called Mule. And
Right.
So there were all sorts of things.
Yeah, a little derogatory, but
yeah.
Anyway, but it's interesting that caddying is like a thing that you're helping. You're not the star. You're helping the star.
Correct.
You're basically setting the table for someone else to shine.
Yeah.
And I found it interesting that you're very comfortable with the interview format, where you have this show.
Yeah.
And you're humble enough to ask others about their life.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of caddy in you when you're sitting in this chair,
Right.
I think.
Oh,
right?
yeah. There is, because the caddy is he's carrying the bag. He's an amateur psychiatrist. He's one thing is you can never, ever be late. Never. If you're late, that's a bad mark.
Yep.
And then one of the big caddy laments is, I've never hit a bad shot, but I've been blamed for some.
Yeah, I'll bet.
Because they need somebody to take it out on.
Yeah,
so you
right
just
there.
have to know. And these days, with the modern technology of the broadcast, there's always somebody there with a microphone, and is going to hear these conversations between caddies and players.
Oh, I thought about that.
And so it can be kind of interesting, and so the caddies have become much more. They never mentioned caddies' names in the old days. Now they do.
Okay.
The broadcasters will, they'll go, oh, so and so, Harry Diamond is a guy who works for Rory McIlroy, who's number 2 in the world.
Yep.
And there's a guy named Ted Scott who works for Scotty Scheffler. He retired a few years ago from working for Bubba Watson, and had done quite well. And then all of a sudden, Scotty Scheffler asked him if he would come back out, unretire, and come and caddy again. And he goes, okay. Since then, he's made about $5 million.
Okay, not a bad gig. That's when you say okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on. So we got still some decades to cover.
Right.
You got an advertising degree. And at that time, so a lot of what we've been talking about is pre-internet days.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you and I share a lot of pre-internet days,
Right.
and we have the post, since the
Yes,
internet. So
yeah.
we have this. We live in a world that has that comparison.
Right.
You a little bit more than me, but not by much. But now we're moving into the 90s and
Yeah.
where the computer started happening.
Yeah.
And your advertising degree started to sort of show up.
Yeah,
In the sense
yeah.
that you were starting to look at radio and computers.
Yeah.
And how did you? I mean, again, you've done a lot. You were doing a lot.
Yeah.
You've had a lot of jobs.
Right.
You've been a lot of places.
Yeah.
You kept on coming back to the Pioneer Valley.
Yeah, yeah.
So here you are. You're back in this area,
Mm-hmm.
and you got some work making websites. And,
In 1995 was when I bought my first computer, and it was also, I think, the same year where I first heard the word internet. I had a girlfriend who was going to Smith College, and so of course they were exposed to it in their curriculum somewhat. I wasn't in college, but I said, "Oh, that sounds interesting. I wonder what that is." So I started finding out more and more about it, and then it was like hooking up with the the modem on AOL, or there was another one that began with the letter P, but I can't remember who that was. So, so you started out with these really, really slow connections, but it was really interesting. And I think so I did think, I heard about, websites, and the first website I built was called Abington.com, ABBINGTON. And the reason I named it that, because it was a site about travel in the New England states. And I named it ABB because that sounded British to me, or whatever. Mm-hmm. And at those days, the lead search engine was Yahoo, and in their results, they listed things alphabetically.
okay.
We hadn't gotten to Google yet or any of that.
Right.
So, that was the first site I built. I really enjoyed doing it. And I made contact with other people who knew little things about HTML in those days. That's how we built websites.
Right. Okay.
And, you'd say, well, how'd you do that? Oh, this is what I did. Oh, okay.
And you were living in this area?
Yes, yeah.
You're living in
I was living in
Amherst.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Right. But you also did a radio show.
Right.
You had a radio experience.
Correct, yeah.
Because Amherst had a radio station that you had an overnight show.
Right.
And that was sort of around the same time. But what got you into the radio thing?
I had always been fascinated by radio. And I remember in high school, there was somebody I knew who was a DJ, and he took me into the studio one night, and I was interested. And the same at UMass, but I just never really pursued it. Mm-hmm. But when I was working for a company in Amherst called Valley Transporter, I was selling advertising for them, and there was a station called WRNX that just started in Amherst. And the salesman from RNX came in one day, and we were talking, and he goes, "You've got a good voice for radio." I said, "Really?" Yeah, I'll think about it. So I said, "Well, okay." So I pursued that, and I got a job as an intern for the Morning Person, who at that time was a kind of a famous local guy. I'll give credit to him. His real name was, Rosher, Lou Rosher, but his radio name was Buddy Rubbish. And he started out up at RSI in Greenfield. He came to RNX in Amherst, so he was the lead guy and the morning guy. And so my job was to pull all the CDs that he was going to play, watching, following the playlist, and then, looking through newspapers if I could find anything that looked interesting that he could read in between, mm-hmm. stuff like that. And, so that was what I would do for him. So I'd be there, he'd pick me up. I was living in Northampton, so was he. And so we'd drive in together in this car. There was a convertible with the top that would not go back up. So this is in cold weather at 6 o'clock in the morning driving.
You and Buddy
Amherst.
Rubbish.
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
That's really funny.
Yeah. And, he was a great guy, and so it was great to, but, and then finally I said, well, I like doing this stuff, but, how can I do it myself? And at that time, they were not on overnight. So I said, why don't you put me on overnight? You don't have to pay me. I'll just learn what I'm doing, and I'll work overnight. So I worked from midnight to 6 a.m. And
5 days a week?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, but it was fun. You know, as soon as Buddy Rubbish told me that all you're doing is you're talking to one person. Once you understand that, everything is fine.
Yeah.
You know, you don't have to worry about anything.
Yeah, you're literally one person.
Yeah,
at
it could
those
be.
hours.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, my first radio show at MUA was an overnight show.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, I know that, but I would get some calls from a couple of people.
Yeah, same people.
Yeah,
After a while, you'd know
yes.
they were working somewhere and they wanted to hear some song.
Yeah, exactly.
Fine.
Yep.
Great.
Okay. All right. So then you had the radio experience. You started to doing the computer stuff, the HTML websites and so on. But then you had an idea. Tell me about when you went down to that cafe in Springfield.
Right. There was one time, you know, I had started doing desktop publishing as well. And one time, a person that I used to work with, because I got a job in the internet as well as caddying at a company called Siberian Outpost in Kent, Connecticut. And somebody that I had worked there with, who both of us had left that, he came up to me one time and said, you know, he wanted to open a coffee shop. And I said, oh, that sounds interesting. So I went along with him.
One of the few things you haven't done yet.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So I went to this, we went to this place in Springfield just to look around, and he was more interested in the coffee shop operation. I saw a sign in the window that said Wi-Fi, and I went, what's that? And so I said that, so I researched that, and I found out that Wi-Fi was just coming on where people could go into a coffee shop and, get online. Bring in their own computer. Some places had computers that they offered, for an hourly fee.
The beginning of wireless.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And so as I looked more into Wi-Fi, my hippie attitude kicked in, saying it should be free. And I said, I was an advocate for free Wi-Fi that businesses would offer as an amenity rather than as a revenue source. Mm-hmm. So that people would come in and buy something while they were there to use the Wi-Fi.
Okay.
And thinking.
And that wasn't happening at that time?
It was just it wasn't happening for free.
Yeah. Okay.
Everybody was charging.
Right.
But I built a website called WiFiFreespot.com, and built that and promoted it. And for several years, if you did a search in Google for free Wi-Fi, my site came up first, which was pretty good. And then they also had a program called AdSense, so that people could choose to advertise on my website for their business. And Google offered a 50, close to 50-50, but not exactly, so that people would click on ads on my site, and I would get revenue from that. So I actually supported myself from that site for about 12, 13 years.
Oh, wow.
Not extravagantly. But it meant that I didn't have to work somewhere else to do it.
Oh, that's fantastic. So then, was that like one of the first of that sort of thing? Because there was several of them, or people just started to offer it for free?
It was, it slowly went so that people would think more people started offering free Wi-Fi.
Okay.
Whether it be restaurants, coffee shops, hotels, anything like that,
But when you decided to do this, that was a new idea.
Yes,
really.
it was. Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Wi-Fi was new, but it was paid Wi-Fi.
So that was sort of your entrepreneurial instincts,
right?
A little bit of your advertising background. You're sort of you're really combining a lot of your disparate skills by landing with that.
Yes.
And doing the publishing and the HTML stuff.
Yeah.
And then at some point you also got into local cable access television.
Correct.
And that was up in Shelburne Falls?
Yes. Yeah.
So can we move to that area, or is there more to talk about in that period of time when you're doing the Wi-Fi?
I was still, the radio still, the commercial radio overlapped with some of the more caddying experiences. So the last time I ever caddied was 1997. Okay. And that's where I went to work for that place in Kent, Connecticut.
Siberian Outpost.
Right.
And they were, I mean, there was a lot of places like that happening.
But they were one of the first. They were one of the first to be able to sell hardware and software online.
So Siberian Outpost was one of sort of a bunch of new kind of businesses
Yeah.
that happened right when the internet happened.
Yes.
So you're selling software and other kind of, how did you find that work?
That was interesting. I had, while I was still caddying, I had arranged through a company in Oregon to do promotion for websites. And I was doing it independently so that I wasn't in Oregon. I was in Amherst, actually, and doing this promotion work. And so one of my clients actually was Siberian Outpost. Mm-hmm. So when I got to the point of thinking about caddying, I said, let's see. And so they offered me a job.
Okay.
And I said, let's see, caddying, lots of travel, you never know what you're going to make, no benefits, versus salary, benefits. I said,
right.
I think it's time for a change.
Okay.
And
how old were you at that point?
You're 52.
Okay.
Yeah. And so then I started working for them exclusively. And I moved to Kent, and I was in the marketing department. And after about half a year or so, though, they promoted me to run their AOL account. They were, as a lot of .com companies were doing at those days, they were going public. And people were making huge fortunes going public. Siberian Outpost didn't turn out to be one of them, but that was their intent. But they felt as though they had to have certain associations with big companies to give them more credence in the market. So they signed a contract with AOL for $5 million for a year to be the exclusive seller of computer hardware and software through the AOL system. And then they brought in people from IBM and other places like that, thinking this is going to make them look better when they go public. They did eventually go public, didn't go as well as they thought. One of the mistakes they made was they decided to go public on a Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock. Doesn't seem to be the right time to go public, But anyway,
that's when you go on the news and give people bad news.
Yeah. And then also what became very prevalent in those days were short sellers, and they picked Siberian Outpost, who eventually became Outpost.com. So I don't want to downplay that too much. They tried, but I left there and whatever.
So you moved on from that job.
Yeah.
And you moved back, well, you were here, but you moved up into Shelburne Falls at that point?
Well, let's see. At first, I went down from Siberian Outpost, I went to work for a place called PC Flowers and Gifts in Bridgeport, Connecticut, doing marketing as well on the internet. And then I went to Portland, Oregon to do work for an online advertising agency, and then came back here after that. And so I didn't end up going up to Shelburne Falls until, maybe 2006 or something like that. But like I say, I had been exposed to public access TV in Northampton and was volunteering doing things for them because they were covering the government meetings, so they actually had people there manning the cameras.
Yep.
These days, it's as Jackson would tell you, it's more automated.
Right. But you participated at Northampton Open Media, or it was Northampton Community Television at that time.
Right. So then when I moved to Shelburne Falls, I just inquired because I learned, they had a station, because most small towns did. Anybody who had a contract with a TV provider, whether it be Comcast or whatever it was in those days.
Continental or something.
So they were responsible for giving money to supply, so they could open up a small station, similar to the deal here.
Yep.
And so I just inquired there, and I said, that sounds great. So I started volunteering there just because they were producing some of their own shows in their own studio.
Right.
And then I worked my way up to doing more stuff, and then ended up getting my own show there. Called Over the Falls.
Right, which I think is kind of a dark name.
It is these days, yeah.
But anyway.
Right. But, and also I did all the programming for them. And,
okay.
And I was able to do it, through the pandemic, because it was set up where I could access the servers from Easthampton to whatever was going to show on the station in Shelburne Falls.
Oh, okay. So you had moved down to Easthampton at that
yeah,
time.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And so that, and then all of a sudden they decided that they wanted somebody to work in the studio to do that work. And I said, no, I'm not going to commute to Shelburne Falls 3 days a week.
Okay.
You know.
So we're talking fairly recent history at this point.
Correct. Yeah.
You'd moved to Easthampton in the Treehouse
Right.
community.
Yeah.
And shortly after that, you wandered over here
yes,
to
correct.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
tell me about how that migration to e-media.
Yeah, no, that was, I was glad to find that there was a similar situation here. And there was, I was well into my retirement years, still not wanting to work, but,
Right.
wanting to do something. And, just the creative spirit or whatever led me down here to start talking about doing a show, because that's what it's all about. At the community public access TV level, they want people like myself to come in and suggest a program and then do it.
Yep.
And so one of the things that I try to stress all the time here is that, you may be watching me, but you could be sitting in this chair. If you've got an idea for a show, come on in and do it. And they'll support you 1,000%.
Yep.
And so luckily, I started doing the show, and I've had some success with it, and I like doing it. I think I do it well, and so I enjoy doing it. And then, I still had ideas about other things, and one day I learned about the low power FM radio station in Florence. And I said, you mean I could still be a DJ again? And I said, I submitted an idea for a program, and they said, sure. Because that's, that exists at the community level. You don't have to think about the big Springfield station or this station or that station or whatever. There's opportunities in media at the base community level.
Yeah, and both of these situations, e-media and WXOJ, are commercial-free,
Yep.
Community radio and community television, and it's really whatever you want to do.
Right.
With some restrictions, but not a whole lot.
Right.
And as someone who's retired and has got time in your hands and
Yep.
still has interests,
Yep.
and let's talk a little bit about getting older. We don't, we could fill a whole show about that.
Yeah,
We probably should,
yeah,
but
yeah.
The sort of situation that you're in, because now I'm semi-retired and I'm at a place where I have more time than I've ever had before.
Yeah.
And I'll be doing a show here at eMedia as well coming up. And I have a radio show on XOJ as well.
Right.
So I'm doing similar things to you. And I think it's
Yeah.
really important that people stay busy, stay engaged.
Yes,
And
yeah,
talk about that a little bit.
It is. It's very important because, like I said, I'll be 79 in a couple months. And, having those words come out of my mouth is totally baffling. And, but it's still, that's the reality. And so just being able to still tie into whatever creative thoughts that I may still have left and whatever, brain cells are still left, I'm just extremely lucky to be able to do what I do. And, it may only be an hour at a time. Like this morning, I had to listen to my radio station that's going to go live on Sunday, so that took up an hour.
Yeah.
And coming here take up about an hour.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I've been coughing a lot lately. And but it just makes whatever life I have going right now, more interesting.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things, though, that are detracting in my life as our bodies physically deteriorate. And our minds go off who knows where, and just trying to have energy or enthusiasm or anything like that, and just trying to live in today's political climate, although I hate to acknowledge it, is difficult. And it's like, well, what's going to happen tomorrow? I have no damn idea at all. And but I'm still here, and that's all you can really do.
How do you look back at your life, and what are you looking forward to?
The way I used to live my life, and like I say, I've never had a career. I've had a lot of jobs. I never had a career, is because I was always somehow fascinated by what might be up around the next corner. And sometimes it wasn't all that great. You know, I made the wrong choice.
But you found out.
I found out. I went, whoop, let's go back. But now it's like, you know, now you kind of know what's up around the next corner. It's just don't know how long it's going to take to get there. But you kind of know what's going to be there. So it's like, you know, wake up in the morning and, you know, and be in this body and with this brain is a challenge at times. Luckily, I made it here this afternoon. I'm enjoying myself right now, totally, you know, just sitting here talking to you.
Right.
And, you know, that's the plus. You know, and the more I can do of that while I'm able, that's what I want to do. And, you know, you and several other people have suggested people for me to interview on the show. That's great. My radio show is I play all my favorite songs, so it can't go wrong.
Yeah, right. Right. Yeah.
You know,
yeah, keep yourself happy now. You deserved it. You've
right,
earned it.
Right.
Yeah.
So that you know, it's, you know, there are certain things that I look back on in my life and I go, well, of course you could say, wish that didn't happen, or I wish that didn't happen, or I wish that did, or whatever, you know. But I mean, what good does that do these days, you know? So
Right.
you know, at this point, but still, you know, I don't want to imply that, you know, that it's horrible, because you know, people are watching this show and saying, you know, what kind of life can you have when you get to a certain age? Well, it's kind of up to you, but you know, take advantage of things like XOJ radio and e-media. Just take advantage of it and you'll enjoy it, because maybe you thought, oh, I can't do that. Sure you can. You can. You just got to sit up here and talk. That's all you got to do.
That's right.
You know?
That's right.
And you might be nervous the first few times, but, you know, having total, you know, trust in you and trust in Jackson, you know, knowing that, you know, something, you know, that's put up here on this screen is actually going to be available for people to watch in a couple weeks.
Right.
And that's interesting. That's quite something.
Well, you're doing this the community a great service, and thank you very much. And it's been an honor to get your story.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay.